Hello, everybody. I'm Sue Kilpatrick, the Chair of Regional Development Australia Tasmania, and I'm delighted to welcome some more than 80 of you to this webinar on our Tasmanian Economic Review. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, the Palawa people, and recognise their ongoing commitment to country and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Now, most of you have probably heard about RDA Tasmania, otherwise you wouldn't be here, but we're one of 50 RDAs around the country funded by the Australian government, and the aim is to facilitate collaborations across the three levels of government and with industry and communities. And what we are aiming for is what we are naming up as a thriving Tasmania. But core to be able to do those things is developing and disseminating data. So we're very much evidence-based. We need to know about our economy and communities, and not just the whole of Tasmania, but at a sub-regional level. And that's what this report's about. So we've had a look at what's happening. We've partnered with Kim Horton and Strategic Economic Solutions to develop this review. And it complements our own knowledge of being out there on the ground, our three regional coordinators, regional development coordinators, who you'll hear from shortly, and our CEO are out there on the ground, and so they and the board have got some insights. We're bringing them together. And so what we are aiming to do here this morning is to start unpacking the so what of all this data that we now have, and for Kim to give you a bit of a look at what we've found. So we're going to get stuck into it without further ado. So the first of our three regional coordinators, who will give us some key themes before Kim talks to us about the detail, is our Southern Coordinator, Jen Newman. So Jen, over to you.
Thank you, Sue, and good morning, everyone. Great to see everyone online. For those who don't know me, my name is Jen Newman and I'm the Southern Regional Coordinator at RDA Tas. So I focus on Southern Tasmania and I'm based in Hobart. So when we look at an economy, we often start with how do you measure it? And there's lots of ways to do that. But we often focus on wealth created, and that is the gross state product. So nationally, there's GDP, which is gross domestic product, but gross state product is what we focus on for our scale of region. And that is really made up from three things, which are the three Ps: population, participation, and productivity. So with population, if you increase the population, you have more people who are buying goods and services, and more people who are employed who can be adding value in the economy. With the participation rate, and Tassie tends to have a lowish participation rate compared to other regions, the more people in the workforce, the more people employed making and adding value to things in goods and services, and also the more people there are who are earning wages and can spend more money in the economy. And lastly, we've got productivity. So if you've got something where you're adding value in a workplace, if it's highly productive, you're adding a lot of value per person. And there are lots of industries that Tassie has large amounts of people employed in, which are low productive industries, such as healthcare and aged care and retail and hospitality, but they're also very important industries for our state. That'll do for me. Anna, I'll pass over to you.
Thanks, Jen. So I'll now quickly touch on the relationship between population inflows, Tasmania's economic performance, and how well our workforce pathways are keeping pace. So over the past decade, we've seen a clear pattern. When more people move to Tasmania, our economic productivity, measured, as Jen said, by GSP per capita, has followed suit. And as we know, inflows are now slowing, so we're likely to see growth in productivity also ease. And this is likely to occur regardless of what happens in the national economy. This makes it more important than ever for us to understand and protect what makes Tasmania attractive. And by doing so, we also need to recognise that not one size fits all. Livability means different things in different parts of our state and for different age groups. So population inflows, though, are doing more than just boosting our economy. They're also helping to ease workforce shortages and soften the impacts of our ageing population. And meanwhile, we're seeing strong growth in demand for highly skilled professionals and trades. And the wages on offer in sectors like teaching, healthcare, policing and aged care are relatively on par with mainland rates. So this tells us that Tasmania's labour market is diversifying. But we're still importing talent at all levels, and that tells us that something is missing. There's a gap between the interests and qualifications of our local population and the jobs available. So solving this isn't just about then increasing our wages, it's about igniting aspiration, supporting Tasmanians into those pathways, and ensuring the education and training landscape enables them to thrive in the roles our economy needs most. Now, I will pass on to Annie, our Northwest Coordinator.
Thank you, Anna. Good morning, everyone. I've got some big topics to cover. So these are, I'll just briefly touch on them before Kim takes a deeper dive into the report. So these are really the key factors that are shaping Tasmania's economic foundations. So first up, we have housing. While prices have surged and then plateaued, there's still, really deep inequalities remain between urban and regional areas. Affordable, secure housing, it's an essential not just for well-being, but for workforce mobility, business investment and regional resilience. Next up, we have education. So Tasmanians, we do perform well at a year 10 level and vocational level, but far fewer complete year 12 or university compared to the national average. This limits our skilled workforce pipeline and underscores the need to align training with local industry demand. Childcare is another critical enabler, and I know this is definitely a hot topic at the moment. Tasmania ranks among the lowest in Australia for childcare accessibility, with much of Tasmania as being labelled as a childcare desert. This restricts workforce participation, particularly for women. Therefore, if we were to expand that access, affordable childcare, it isn't just a social policy, it is an economic infrastructure. On a positive note, however, business growth has been really strong, especially in construction, healthcare, and professional services. This, it does reflect optimism, but it also raises pressure on skills like digital capability, cybersecurity and infrastructure, those sorts of things. Tasmania, it more than punches above its weight in terms of innovation, from major players like we've got Procreate, Someday, to a lot of, smaller emerging SaaS ventures. Our ecosystem, it blends high-tech visibility with grassroots enterprises, and it's something that, it's a really growing strength that needs to be continued and supported. To close, unlocking Tasmania's potential means investing in more than just businesses. Education, childcare and housing, they're the core infrastructure of a sustainable and inclusive economy. These are a very broad overview of key findings, and Kim will talk in much greater detail on each of these foundations and how they actually contribute to Tasmania's economic landscape. So with that, I'll hand it back to James to introduce Kim and deep dive into a lot of those foundational principles that we're seeing here.
Thanks, Annie, Anna and Jen. We're delighted to have partnered with Dr. Kim Horton from Strategic Economic Solutions. So Kim, most recently, before going back into consulting world, was co-CEO and also chief economist for the Regional Australia Institute, which is certainly one of Australia's primary data and insight organisations when it comes to regional Australia, which Tasmania as a whole is classified as regional. So we're delighted to have Kim with us this morning, and he'll do the deep dive. We'll go till about 11:05 or thereabouts with Kim. So this is a very informational component of the webinar. And then we've got about 20 minutes or so allocated to questions. If you have questions, please pop them in the chat. We're going to use the chat as our primary question mechanism, and I'll curate those questions when we get to that period. Just letting people know also that we are recording this, and that is for the purpose of if at the end of this, we will have the slides and the recording up on the website, so people can go back and review the detail as well. Kim, thank you.
Well, thank you, James. Good morning, everyone. And thank you very much to Sue, Anna and Annie for that overview too. It really helps, I think, to highlight some of the key things that we drew out of this work early, so that you can, I'll build a bit of a picture of those key findings as we go through today. As James said, I've been working on regional economies for a long time. I grew up in Hobart, but have been sort of practicing as a regional economist, I suppose, for most of the last 25 years or so. And I'm coming to you this morning from Gunai country in Gippsland, where we're doing some work on regional wellbeing. But this Tasmanian review was a real privilege to work on. We spent a lot of time thinking about the implications. So this morning there will be quite a lot of data. I think the report's available, isn't it, James? And people can read along, or they can certainly send the slides through if people want that as well. But it's data rich. I mean, one of the things that the RDA wanted was a compilation of reasonably up-to-date data about the state of the Tasmanian economy. They did one of these reviews a couple of years ago, so it was time to update that. And what we tried to do was not only gather the data together in a way that makes it accessible to people, but also put a fair bit of interpretation around it. So often economists are a bit wary of doing the so whats about what large amounts of data do, but we've really tried to do that with this one, and I'll step you through those interpretations and conclusions as we go. And I'll finish up with some considerations that we put forward to the RDA to think about what its role, what it might do to sort of enhance Tasmania's economy, given the things that are available at its disposal to influence those things. So to start at the beginning, updating the sort of trajectory of Tasmania's economy from the previous report, which was done in 2021. So there's a bit of a focus on the last couple of years, 21 to 2023. That's when most of the data was available when we finished writing this report early this year. Some of the data, we've got more current data yet, but some of the high level data was through to 2023. So the big change, I think, and I'll talk about this in this slide here, that the big change was that Tasmania really came surging out of COVID really strongly. You'll see in the next chart that Tasmania's gross state product growth rate was pretty high leading into COVID, and was actually pretty high coming out of COVID as well. I think those lockdowns worked very effectively for sort of neutralising. They were hard for people in the state, but they really neutralised some of those short to medium term effects, so that businesses were ready to sort of kick up again once that interstate travel opened up. So between 21 to 23, Tasmania's economy grew quite strongly, certainly in relative terms to the gross state product in previous years. But that chart on the left there, you can see we've broken that up into those three Ps that Sue was talking about. The big dark blue box in that left-hand chart is workers per population. So the biggest contributor to that GSP, gross state product growth in Tassie over that period, was more people in the workforce who were working. There was a real surge in the participation rate. The next biggest contribution was that population growth that Sue also touched on. Offset to a small degree, there was a small loss in overall productivity per worker in that period. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what productivity means and doesn't mean a little later on, but just hold that thought that the biggest drivers of those that really strong increase in overall output in that period, the biggest increase there was more people working, which, as Sue said, generates more income, and there's a lot of flow on from that, as well as that population growth. Now, the chart on the right, I wanted to compare that with what happened over the last decade. So we broke it up into two periods, 2 5-year periods, and this starts to show some of those sort of medium-term structural changes that are going on in the Tasmanian economy. Up to 2018, that population growth was still the biggest single component of overall output growth, followed by more workers, participation rate increasing. But you can see there on the top of that little bar on the left is you've got this productivity dividend. So there was more output per worker. There was significant growth in output per worker in Tassie over that 5-year period. Now, like most of the rest of Australia, that output per worker number has gone backwards in the last 5 or 6 years. So when we look at what's happened in the second part of that 10-year period, that's very, very small. And as we could see before, it actually turned negative in the last couple of years. The biggest contribution, again, and it's split very evenly now between that overall population growth, which grows the economy, as Sue said, and then that worker productivity. Worker participation, so more people working. So what you've seen a bit of a change in Tassie, that big increase in the number of people actively participating in the workforce has had a big impact on overall state economic levels of economic activity. So this is why we keep focusing on this report, and how Annie's and Anna's comments were around whether there's a good match between the skills of that workforce and what the business community is looking for and what the public sector community is looking for in terms of workers. Because the more workers we have involved in work, they can see there's a very significant impact on overall state output, and output's one of the sort of key goals often of a state government. I prefer output per capita, and we'll come to that in a minute. Annie, could you change that, move that slide on? Yeah, thank you. So where's that growth fit coming from within the Tasmanian economy? I think there's a bit of concern often in Tassie that it's very much a public sector or public sector derived economy. There's a lot of public services, education, health, as well as administrative services that Tassie does. But we wanted to put it together in a slightly different way. In fact, those they're called the which ones are they? They're the household. No. They're the essential household services. So they're the ones that include health, education, and that sort of public administration one. So that's there up the top in that bar chart on the left. They're pretty strong, both in terms of value-added and local jobs. But when you combine the business services, which are essentially largely private businesses providing services to other largely private and public businesses, they're actually bigger than that largely public sector group of education, health, and sort of public administration. So you pull together things like finance and insurance, rental housing, real estate, information, IT, information, media, telecommunications, professional, technical and scientific workers, of whom there are quite a few in Tassie, and then administrative services that are basically traded between businesses. That group of business services is actually a larger part of overall economic output and overall employment than health, education and the rest of the sort of narrowly defined public sector. So I think that's important. That is something that's important to keep in mind. Yes, Tassie does have a significant sort of public sector economy, but it's also got quite a lot of sort of private companies that are providing services to other private companies and to the public sector. Agriculture is also quite strong. Primary production is quite a large part of overall economic output, less so with jobs, and tourism is also quite a large sector too. In fact, tourism's moved up to the second largest of the large groupings, but ag's been really strong in Tassie over the last few years. So can we move on to the next one? Thank you. So tourism has been a strong and increasingly important part of the Tassie economy. So we were quite keen to see what those air passenger numbers look like. So this doesn't include the spirits. This just includes the air movement in and out of Launceston and Hobart. You can see quite seasonal, within each year there's a strong summer peak and a winter lull. But you can see that before this really dropped off very sharply in COVID when those internal borders closed, that's what you'd expect. But before that, there was pretty steady growth, in those peak season numbers. They were heading up, and they were just got over about 420,000 just before COVID. So those numbers have been going up steadily in terms of people coming in, visitors coming in by plane. Then big drop off, and then you can see it really bouncing around after COVID as those borders sort of opened and closed and people tried to sort of readjust. But I think the real story on the right-hand side of that chart is you've got the strong seasonal peak there, but the actual headline numbers in combined air passenger numbers for Launceston and Hobart getting very close to the previous peak, which is just before COVID. And the last data that we had when we were producing the report was for November last year. And those numbers were just below the previous peak. So we're looking at about 360,000 just for the month of November, which was just below the previous peak just before COVID. So it was looking very much to us like earlier this year, we'd be coming back and setting a new record for the number of air passenger movements through those two airports. So on that basis, it's looking like there's that tourism is back fairly strongly in Tasmania. Now, I want to touch now on those 3 Ps that Sue was talking about. The chart on the left shows this really quite strong overall economic output performance for Tasmania over the last, particularly over the sort of 4 or 5 years leading into COVID. The green line is Tassie, the blue line is the rest of Australia. You can see that Tassie was, Australia on the left-hand side there around 2012, 2013, had a big surge in output, really driven by that mining investment boom that was going on at that stage. Tassie wasn't a big part of that, so in relative terms, Tassie's output growth dropped, and it was sitting below, in annualised terms, sitting below Australia through till about 2017, when things really started to take off. Tasmania's rate of output growth grew for the next 2 years. It then dropped for COVID, of course, as did everybody. But you can see, I think, from the next bit through 2021, Tassie's growth really bounced back much faster than the rest of Australia and held up through 2022. But it's turned, and I want to talk a fair bit about that this morning, is when did things start to turn and why? What are the drivers of this fall off in overall growth state product? On the right-hand side, you can see that in relative terms compared to the other states, over the last 2 years of this report, 21-23, Tassie's overall growth state product growth was pretty solid, just over 3%, and was one of the well above the national average. It was only South Australia that, and to some extent Queensland, it was just about the same, but South Australia had biggest growth. But again, a bit like Tassie, South Australia has quite a volatile state economy, and it was coming off a long period of very low growth. So it had a bit of a surge, and Tassie had a bit of a surge as well in the same period. So really strong result, I think, overall for that whole period, sort of pre and post-COVID. But things have turned. Things have turned in the last 18 months, and we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. Now, the next one, I think, is going to look at the population component of that. Can we have the next one? Yeah, thank you. No, that's cool. That's cool. That's cool. So we're talking about participation, and then I'm going to talk about population. So remember, in those very early charts, you could see this increase in the role of more people participating in the workforce. That was really playing a big role in overall economic growth. Great, really good outcome. And in that chart on the left, you've got Australia on top in the dark blue and Tassie down below in the green. It's a little bit hard to see, but post-COVID, it looks to me like there's a general trend upwards. So the participation rate in Tassie was sort of heading up from about 60% of those over 15 in the labour force, heading up to around 62. So that's pretty strong growth, and it's that growth in participation that underpin those contributions to those components of state economic growth overall. So, as you know, it's only going from 60 to 62, but that does have a significant impact on the overall level of economic activity, and it's a really good result for Tassie. You can see it's been bouncing around between 60 and 62 for quite some time, whereas Australia as a whole has been gradually steadying up, apart from that dip in COVID, from more 64 to 66. So we've got two things going on here. We've got Tassie gradually catching up to the national sort of level, but still quite a bit below. So by the time we get to the end of 2022, Tassie's sitting on about 62% participation, while the national average is around 66. So the gap's still there, but it was closing. End of 2022, though, things really started to turn around. You can see the national line on top there keeps going up, slowly, but gradually going up. So more and more people are participating in the workforce nationally. Whereas with Tassie, it's turned down again. So we've got two conflicting bits of information sort of feeding into our overall sort of interpretation, which is things were going pretty well through to 2022. The gap was still there with the national average, but it was starting to close. Whereas in the last couple of years, that gap's really started to widen again. And I looked at this chart and thought, wow, the gap between Tassie's participation rate and the national one is now wider than it's ever been, at least in the last 10 years. So that's quite a significant issue. Why are people bailing out of the labour force? I'm going to show you in a minute. It's not because of a lack of jobs. There's something else going on in the Tassie workforce, that's pulling people out of wanting to be in the workforce. And on the right hand side, you can see that compared to the other states, Tassie's participation rate is really quite low at the moment. So next one, I think we'll be looking at population. Oh no, we've got productivity leaders. Okay, no, that's cool. No, that's cool. Yeah. This one, yeah. So productivity. that's what we're looking at was participation in the labour force. Productivity is the amount of output. It's a fairly clunky measure, actually. It's the amount of output that one employee in that industry is worth, and it comes from the national input-output tables, where you've got all the industries aggregated and they're all producing a certain level of billions of dollars of output. How many workers have they got? You divide one by the other, and that gives you a measure of output per worker. In Tassie, you've actually got 5 industries that have, on those fairly crude measures, a higher level of value of output per worker than the national average. So that information, media, telecommunications, relatively small workforce, but really highly productive in Tassie. So the business turnover is really high for that industry relative to the number of workers. Ag's also a real standout. Agriculture, you can see that there's we all know this, that Tassie tends to produce more sort of high value ag products than some of the broadacre ag outputs on the mainland, and that comes through in the data. So per worker, there's about a $20,000 sort of premium in terms of value of output for Tassie ag workers. Now, the same is true for healthcare and social assistance in terms of the level of output of the industry and the numbers of workers in it. Now, I was a bit concerned about this because you could have a sort of I wanted to investigate to see whether this healthcare output was simply because there wasn't enough workers, and so you artificially kind of inflating the level of output in a strained system. But the Productivity Commission had a good look at this a couple of years ago, and the way that these healthcare and social assistance outputs are measured, because it's not like a business output, it's kind of, you can't just look at the levels of activity in the health sector, you've really got to look at the outcomes. And the Productivity Commission have saying that when we look at the health industry in particular, it's a difficult one to analyse in this frame compared to other more product-related industries. But it does the health data is based on better outcomes, especially in terms of saving lives and non-readmission. So when the folks at the ABS look at the output for a healthcare and social assistant, it's pretty clear that they're basing it on actual health outcomes rather than just activity levels in the sector sort of financial one. So I think that's a good sign, because it's saying it's not just that Tassie's got a high level of sort of activity for its workers in the health sector, but they're having an impact. They're getting in terms of things like saving lives and reduced readmissions. The other 2 industries, the gaps are smaller, but there's still a bit of a premium there for arts and recreation services, which says that for every worker in that sector, they're producing a higher value added than workers on the mainland, and the same for financial and insurance services. Again, for both of those, the total numbers employed are relatively small, but it's really good that those smaller numbers of people are actually able to punch above their sort of industry average wage a bit compared to their colleagues on the mainland. So we had a quick look at participation, a quick look at productivity, and now we'll have a slightly longer look at population, because there's some very interesting sort of relationships, I think, that have emerged out of this analysis for Tasmania. So you'll all be very much aware that, because I've watching Tassie for a long time, there's always been ebbs and flows in population numbers. There seems to be a roughly 5-year cycle of increasing flows from the mainland, and then we go back to shedding people back to the mainland, and then it reverses again, and we see this over the very long term. The chart on the bottom left compares the rate of population growth of Tasmania in the green with Australia as a whole in the blue. And you can see this is this sort of 5-year cycle thing. So up to about 2016, Tassie's rate of population growth was really very, very low. In total term, it was less than 0.5% per year, whereas the national average was about 1.5% a year. That switched in 2017. Tassie's overall population growth suddenly jumped from about 0.5% to around 2%, which is really strong. It's more than replacement. This is actually a good, solid population growth pathway for Tassie. While nationally it was holding steady at about 1.5. So you had this sort of 5-year period where Tassie's population growth rate was above the national average, and including through COVID, because those international borders were closed nationally, our national population growth really suffered a lot in 2021, and there was a rebound in 2022. But because of Tassie's population growth actually held pretty steady through 2021, because a lot of that population growth in Tassie was coming not from overseas, but from other states, as people rediscovered Tasmania post those lockdowns. So you've got a really solid period of population growth. That definitely, as Sue was saying, that increases the size of the economic cake, just more actors, more players, more economic activity. But as we'll see in a minute, it also improves the output per person. Now, the one on the right is quite interesting as well, because it breaks down that population growth in terms of the key components of population change. There are 3 of those. The little dark green one is the natural increase, so the births minus deaths across Tassie, and you can see that little dark green splodge was higher earlier on in this period, and then it's been very, very stable. There's been a very sort of not much movement in the variation of births and deaths in Tassie, and it was a bigger contribution overall sort of almost 10 years ago, but in the middle period it's been a relatively small player. And all our industrialised countries are worried because the replacement rate's the birth rate's not high enough to replace death. So most of our industrialised countries, their populations are stable or going backwards, except for international migration. Tassie's got a very similar sort of pattern compared to those nations. The green one the green one was natural increase. The orange one is net interstate migration, so the number of people coming to Tassie minus the number of people leaving Tassie. And then the blue one is net overseas migration, which is the same thing. It's the number of people leaving Tassie for overseas minus the number of people coming, or the other way around, the people come minus the number of people. So it's those net flows, whether there are more people coming to Tassie from other parts of the country or more people coming to Tassie from other parts of the world. Now, the blue one, the net overseas migration, has been consistently pretty positive, except for those COVID years when it really shrunk down, of course. So in this period of population growth, 2017 to 2022, it was a really solid contributor to that overall population result for the state. And certainly in the last couple of years, in keeping with this catch-up of lots of net overseas migration to the nation as a whole, Tassie's benefiting from that. So you've had very large numbers of folks coming in net terms from overseas to Tassie. That's those 2 big bars on the right-hand side. The big swing factor for me is these orange ones, is the flows between Tassie and other states. You can see at the start of this period on the chart, Tassie was losing people to other parts of the country. That's why those population rates in the left-hand charts, those growth rates were so low, under 0.5%. That switches, and for about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, we've had a net flow of people into Tassie from other parts of the country. In some of those years, really quite sizable numbers. This is where you feel a lot of communities are feeling those population pressures. It's harder to get to see a GP. There's longer queues at the petrol station. And and housing prices, of course, have been significantly impacted by this net flows. But again, as I said earlier on, there's been a bit of a change in the last couple of years, and that strong positive net flow between Tassie and the rest of the country switched in 2022, negative again. So you've got a net flow out from Tassie to other parts of the country since then, and that net flow is quite large in absolute and relative terms in 2023. So we might have a look. The next one, Anna, in where those people are coming and going, because it's quite interesting to see what's driving or what's underpinning those changes in net flows. And it turns out that it's more to do with people not coming to Tassie than it is with people leaving Tassie. Have you got that next slide?
It's not
there?
changing. Sorry, for some.
Yeah, I know. I know it does that from time to time.
I can try and I'll reshare. I'll stop sharing. Resharing. Sorry. Okay,
that's all right. No, I know the situation you're in. So if you think about these net flows, it's the number of people coming to Tassie minus the number of people leaving for the mainland. And when it switched, it wasn't to do with more people leaving Tassie to go to the mainland. I know that lots of Tasmanian residents were concerned about the perceptions about less access to services and quality of life kind of getting compromised because of this period of really high population growth, and so people leaving. It wasn't so much people leaving Tassie for the rest of the country as the flows, as for some reason, and we're not quite sure what this is, Tassie was starting to emerge as a less attractive place for people from the mainland to come to. So with less people coming, and the number of people coming to Tassie dropped by about 1,000 a year in the last couple of years, relative compared to the period before. So that takes a lot of pressure off that sort of steady growth in demand for housing and steady growth in demand for services. But as we were talking about before, that population growth has actually been a pretty important part of Tasmania's overall economic story. So if population growth starts to slow because Tassie is less attractive, and I'll show you a chart in a minute that says that has pretty significant implications for the overall state economy in total. So it's not just that Tassie's population booms when the economy is booming. The other thing happens as well. Tassie's economy kind of really struggles when those population flows start to turn the other way. Can you go back one, Anna?
One, yeah.
Oh, no, sorry, no, leave it there, leave it there. That's right, no, you're right. So yes, it's all right. I've jumped ahead a bit, but what I wanted to do before I show you those pictures about where people are coming from, just looking forward in the longer term, these are the state government projections. It's pretty clear that, well, I'm not sure why, but the state government's overall population growth numbers are definitely at the low end of the ranges that we've seen over the last decade. So as we saw in the previous slide, it's been between about 0.5% a year and up to about 2%. So the Tassie state government official forecasts projections are very much on the low side. They're expecting around only 0.5% growth per year on average over the next 20 years. That means, of course, significant changes in the demographics, and the chart on the right shows that the largest population service age groups are at the upper end. So we've got a significant growth in numbers and percentages for seniors, elderly, but also the people in sort of middle working age, those parents and home builders and other workers and pre-retirees numbers are growing quite strongly too. But there's because of if you're looking at just 0.5% growth, and again that's going to be dominated by heavily influenced by the flows in and out of Tassie compared to the mainland. Without that strong natural increase, there's going to be a gradual decline in the number of people in these younger age groups. So Tassie's economy is going to mature, the labour force is going to mature. So let's go, Annie, to that next one, which looks at where people are coming from. So this is the longer term history here. We're going back about 10 years now of the flows in and out of Tassie. The inflows are in green and the outflows, the departures, the outflows are blue and the inflows are green. So what's happened in this sort of growth period was the inflows, the green numbers are sitting well above the departures. So that's why we've seen this overall population growth over that 5-year period from 2017 to 2022. Really big pickup post-COVID. You can see the green post-2020, the green line well above the blue line, kind of tracking then for the next few years as population growth slowed. And then post that dip, so looking from 2022 onwards now, the blue line, the departure numbers are still up. So they're sitting at around 4,000 people per year leaving the state. Now that is higher than it's been in the last little bit, but it's only slightly higher than it was in that growth period from 2017 to 2022. What has changed, and what is the big difference between that growth period and this one, is that those arrivals have dropped. So the average number of arrivals has fallen by about 1,000 a year, from around 4,000 to around 3,000. So that's why those net interstate migration flows have changed so much just in the last couple of years. And if we look at the next one, you'll see where people are coming and going from and to. So on the left-hand side here, we've got Tassie. We've got a big deficit. There's that in the flows to Victoria. So we've got this is the inflows and outflows by state from Tassie at the moment. Big outflows to Victoria. Down the bottom there, inflows, so still net gains from New South Wales, but a big net loss to Victoria, smaller net loss to WA and the other states. If you look at what's happening in Victoria, you can see it's getting a net gain from Tassie. That's the sort of the 1, 2, 3, third group of ours. So there's that net gain of about 2,000 a year from Tassie. But that's only a small part of things for Victoria, because they've got a big net loss to Queensland and a significant net gain from New South Wales. So the Tassie flow is only a small part of the overall Victorian picture. Those numbers are much, much bigger for Victoria. But those 2,000 a year, they make a big difference to Tasmania's population trends and will make a difference to Tasmania's population projections as they continue. Now, one of the things I want to show you later on is when we look at the I think the house price, I think that the package that Tassie offers and how that's perceived by people on the mainland, and we can see from this, particularly by people in Victoria, has a really important impact on what those flows look like. And as I said, when those flows are in Tassie's favour, the whole economy grows, and it grows per person as well. So understanding a bit how that all fits together is really important. So this is not Victoria, this is all the flows in and out of Tassie. And what we found here, we're trying to see what these changes in gross state product per capita, what they were correlated with, because we've now, sorry, I should have gone back. We're looking now not just at gross state product, which is the overall size of the cake, but we're looking at gross state product per capita. So it's how much of that, how big the slices are for each person in Tassie. And the interesting thing for me, because gross state product, it's kind of great to grow the economy, but it's better if that growth actually flows through it's not just growing through there's more people, but people are benefiting from that growth in terms of gross state product per capita. That's more of a sort of end goal for me than just headline sort of GDP and GSP numbers. And when we look at that output per person, there's a significant, it's been really quite volatile over the last 10 years that we had this data for, but that volatility correlates very, very closely with the number of interstate arrivals. So we're just talking about the inflows here too. There's also a relationship with the net flows, of course, people coming minus people going, but it's actually a closer correlation with the inflows. So the more attractive Tassie is for people from interstate, the more the Tassie economic cake grows, and the more that's shared effectively across all those people. So there's significant implications there, I think, in terms of what that underlying driver of output growth and output growth per capita is for Tassie. It's not just that the cake's getting bigger, but when we've got strong inflows, you're actually getting a bigger dividend per resident as well. So there's something pretty significant there about the perception of Tassie as a question, as a thing. James, we had a question there. Do you want to take that now, or should we?
We might keep going, Kim. If people could just put their questions in the chat for the moment and save them up, just so we can get through the material. And then
no worries. So this one looks a bit gnarly, but what it's showing us here is these are job vacancies. So we're not talking about employment projections. We're talking about jobs that are actually advertised by employers, public and private. We've got about 15 years worth of data here, and the federal government does this really well. It's a really good data set. It tells you what employers are looking for, and it tells us a number of things. It tells us that the cumulative numbers of jobs advertised has been quite high. It peaked at around 4,700 jobs in January 2024. So January last year, there was a really strong peak in demand for workers. So, and this is at a time when the population was growing too. So I guess I'm trying to sort of give you this sense that this population growth is actually good for the economy as a whole, and good for the individuals who are working in the economy as well. Often with very large levels of population growth, you might expect job growth to fall, or you might expect unemployment to rise because there aren't enough jobs. What this is telling us is that some of that population growth is really driven by people coming to fill jobs that are advertised by employers, and then there's this sort of cycle of growth where that creates other jobs. That's the big picture. You can see there's a drop off in COVID, and I won't spend too much time on that. What I do want to sort of touch on is the makeup of those jobs. So what sort of jobs are employers advertising, and how's that changed over time? The really big change, and it happened pre-COVID, but it really accelerated post-COVID, is that the number of jobs that Tasmanian employers are advertising in that professionals category. Now, professionals include public sector professionals, but also private sector professionals, business services, marketing, data analytics, as well as health and medical and educational professionals. There's quite a mix of public and private jobs in that professionals group. Now, they're the dark blue that's sitting above the green on the bottom. And if you look at that chart, you can see that there's been a massive growth in the number and share of those dark blue jobs over from about 2018 onwards. everything collapsed during COVID, but there's been a real surge in those professional jobs since then. The other two big growth areas are tradies, they're the orange ones. They've kept fairly steady in terms of numbers. Clerical and admin, they've grown quite significantly post-COVID as well. They're the blue ones, but also the yellow ones, community and personal service workers. Now, they're the sort of glue that hold our communities together in terms of providing a range of person-to-person and community-wide services. There's been a lot of growth for those workers as well. So those four categories, professionals, trades, community personal service workers and clerical, they're the bulk of the jobs. And in fact, I put a stat in there of the jobs that were advertised in January this year, around a third of those were in professions. Now, a decade ago, just 18% of vacancies were professions. So there's been a really significant increase. Now, what that says to me is, we talk a lot about needing to create jobs and create good jobs, and we do. And the RDA is one of many organisations that are supporting that. But what this is telling us is actually the employers are doing that pretty well. There's a lot of job creation and a lot of job creation at these higher wage levels, whether it's technical trades or professionals. Thanks, Annie. So then let's look at the next one. Yeah, so let's look at the foundations then. So that's the market. The job market's been growing very strongly. Everything's cooled off in Australia over the last sort of 6 to 8 months, but following a long period of growth. But let's look at some of the foundations in Tasmania. We talked a little earlier on about education. Tasmania does very well for Year 10, not so well for Year 12, and not so well for tertiary. On the left there, you can see that Tassie has a lower than a higher share of people compared to the national average who have just completed Year 10 and don't have a higher year of schooling. On the right-hand side, that's broken down by regions, and again, we can see that there's quite a bit of regional difference. The northwest is very much a trades area. That's we're looking at sort of trades and the percentage of the workforce with trade qualifications and population with trade qualifications is quite high. Down south, it's different. It's a bit more. If there's any part of the state that's leading in terms of bachelor's degrees and postgraduates, it's down south, but there's chicken and egg there because you've got those university facilities and those university research centres which both create more people with those degrees and then employ them as well. So overall, there's been a lot of discussion in Tasmania over the last 4 or 5 years about this, that the level of education sits a little bit below the national average. So when we think about that in terms of those jobs, employers are looking for high-skilled trades. Good, Tassie's got a good supply of those, but they're also looking for these professions and service sector workers. There's not evidence here of a matching growth in supply of people with those sorts of qualifications. And the next one, I think, is disadvantage. So we're looking at how socioeconomic disadvantage is distributed across Tasmania. This used to be the CEFA index. It's one of the key elements of the CEFA index in terms of it's an indicator of relative economic disadvantage. The darker the red, the more the area is below the national average in terms of socioeconomic advantage. And you can see that through the middle of the state and up in the northeast, there's quite a lot of areas with high levels of relative disadvantage. Generally, if you look at the map of Tassie on the left, the cities, Launceston and Hobart, are kind of the bluest, so they're kind of got least areas of disadvantage. But when you look within Launceston and Hobart, there are clearly there's the haves and the have-nots. There are clearly suburbs that have got still quite high levels of relative disadvantage, sitting alongside suburbs that have got relatively high levels of advantage. So there's a geographical discrepancy there, which has an impact, I think, on labour market and labour market performance as well. Childcare, big issue. I think one of the reasons behind that persistent gap between Tasmania's participation rate and the mainland is this relative lack of childcare. The numbers are pretty stark. This is the Mitchell Institute. They do a sort of a big review every couple of years of the availability of childcare places across the nation. And their story for Tassie is not good. You've got a big swathe of sort of central and western Tasmania with very little availability of childcare. And even by national standards, there's a really sort of poor performance here in terms of that availability. Overall, nationally, Tasmania has the lowest level of childcare places per person in the whole country at around 0.352. And over half of Tasmanian regions were classified as childcare deserts in 2024, no change in 2020. And this is way above the proportion of places that are classified as childcare deserts in other places. The only one that came vaguely close is Western Australia, which is a vast geography. Tassie is a small geography performing very badly. And I think this is one of the things that needs to change in order to improve that labour force participation figure. Now, this is kind of interesting. Now, these charts are sort of squished up a bit here, but I find this really interesting. It ties very closely, in my view, with those population flows, and particularly with the high levels of inflows, and when they turned and became lower levels of inflows and offset against those higher levels of outflows. The upper figure is Launceston. Launceston was really fascinating. I was watching Launceston very closely when I was at the Regional Australia Institute, and we had a good partnership with the Commonwealth Bank, looking at where their customers were moving. And that gave us really early insights post-COVID into how people were relocating in that really volatile period, 2020 and 2021. Launceston jumped out to us in that data very early on, late 2020, once those once the sort of state borders opened. Launceston was the standout in terms of the number of people flowing in. It really went from sort of nowhere on those maps to one of the top 2 or 3 for probably 3 or 4 quarters. It really saw very significant inflows of people over quite an extended period of time. And you can see that in the house price data, right? I mean, this is the kind of thing that we all experience. So that upper chart is for Launceston. And you can see that rapid uptick towards the right-hand side. There was a little downswing before that, which was COVID, and we were all worried about the construction boom that we were going, the construction collapse, and so there's a lot of money going into prop up construction. In fact, there never was a collapse, so all that money just went into pushing up prices. It was completely crazy. So Launceston, you can see Launceston's house prices grew very fast over a very short period. We're looking at a period of about 18 months there, and then started to plateau. And since then, so there's quite a long period there now of about another sort of 2 years or so, where those Launceston house prices have been fairly stable after a very quick run up. Hobart's pattern down below is a little different. It also had a slight dip around COVID, but it had a more gradual run up than Launceston, and it didn't and it peaked a little bit later. So it didn't go up as much in proportional terms, and didn't peak as early, but it also has been stable. Now, the interesting thing I think for all of everybody in Tasmania who's interested in this overall economic performance, I guess what I've been saying is that there's a strong connection between how Tassie is perceived as a place to live and work by people from other parts of the country. That perception is really important because it flows through into overall economic performance for the state, which is kind of counter to the way most economic models work. They sort of say the economy grows, then people go. I think what we're seeing in Tassie, it's kind of the reverse. People go and the economy grows as well. And I think the big swing factor here, I think a lot of it is to do with house price availability and house prices. Particularly, I think this last sort of comment down the bottom there about the relativities with Melbourne. The relative price points in Tassie have become much closer. When they plateaued, they were plateauing at a level that's much closer to the sort of median price point across the whole of Greater Melbourne, particularly outer Melbourne. So as Tassie loses its sort of house price advantage, that I think is when those inflows started to drop, and people were either not moving, they were staying in Victoria, staying in outer Melbourne, or they were going somewhere else. So getting on top of that, on that housing, and getting at the right mix of housing, the right quality of housing, and the right sort of places with the right sort of services, sounds a bit fluffy. Most economists will say that's a result of good economic growth. I guess I'm kind of turning that around and saying, well, we've actually got to get that right in order to create economic growth. And next one, Annie, I'm going to finish up in a minute. Freight costs at the same time. This is not related particularly to COVID, when we know there was a shortage of containers and freight costs went up around the world post 2020 for a short time. But this is more about the sheer volume of freight coming in and out of Tassie, and the freight cap on the freight equalisation scheme. So I won't go into this in great detail. You can see there's the level of exports of different commodities on the left. On the right is your 20-foot container comparative price. And the important one there is the orange line on the bottom, which is post-subsidy. So because the subsidy is kind of capped, we're now seeing more people claiming the subsidy, and there's more freight moving that's claiming the full subsidy. So it's kind of reached a kind of peak. So what that does, unfortunately, it's led to a significant increase in the cost per container for anybody shipping freight out of Tasmania. We looked quite a bit at business growth. There's been a lot of business formation in Tassie, as I think Annie said. That was really good to see. There's always a lot of volatility in the small business sector in particular. So I wanted to go a little bit below the headline that says, that we've had 2,000 new transport businesses in the country over the last couple of years. That's really good. It is good, but I wanted to go a bit underneath that and see, well, how long are those businesses surviving? Are we just seeing churn in this business growth, or are we actually seeing sort of net growth and overall expansion in the business sector? When you look at that data, it tells quite a different story. You've got quite a lot of businesses, particularly in the ag sector, also chemical, beverage manufacturing, metal fabrication. They've got really strong survival rates. So the numbers are growing slowly, and those that are coming in are actually surviving quite well over the sort of the typical 3 to 5 years that people measure these things. At the other end of the scale, what I was worried about is playing out in that, yes, we've got a lot of new business entries in some sectors, but unfortunately, those businesses are just blowing up. They're just not lasting. And that's particularly important for Tassie in the transport, courier and distribution businesses. There were 2,000 new businesses in that sector between June 2020 and June 2024, but a whole lot of those just burnt out. So the overall survival rate for those businesses that entered around June 2020 was less than 50%. We know that that's a really difficult sector to operate in. It's that last mile distribution chain. You've got a lot of very small operators setting themselves up as a part of the courier or the transportation business. But what it's showing is that there's quite a lot of collateral damage as that sector really pushes for efficiency. So when we look at these business numbers in Tassie, I think it's really important not just to look at the headline growth in whether there are more or less businesses or whether there's been new business entries, but how are they doing? How are they surviving? And it points to some weaknesses, I think, in the Tassie economy. That churn rate, if you've got less than 50% of those businesses surviving 4 years, there's a hard personal toll in that, and there's a hard sort of industry toll, because it means you're not getting those economies of scale and you're not getting those efficiencies that come with experience in those operators. Next one, I'm going to finish up in a minute. We had a look at a few particular aspects of the Tasmanian economy that hadn't really received much attention. One of those was innovation. Tassie actually does pretty well, I think, in a lot of innovation measures. The ecosystem in Tassie is pretty strong. It made me think that Tassie's done as a sort of small, people often sort of criticise it for being a small market, which it is, but I think it's leveraging that small market status pretty well. So you've got a few degrees of separation and a lot of social capital building, because there are it's not a huge market. It's a sort of small but quite close knit market. I put that image there from the Kaufman Foundation about entrepreneurial success, just to show everybody that it's not just around business formation. There's a lot of social and cultural aspects to a successful innovation culture. Finance is part of it, but it's only one part of it. There's other issues around, and place attractiveness comes in there as a key thing, because you can't really grow a business through employment in a place which isn't attractive to, if you can't attract the workers you need to grow your business, it becomes really, really difficult. So good innovation policy actually has a number of drivers. Wellbeing approach to Tasmania reflects, I think, do we have social enterprises? Yeah. Social enterprises are really quite an important part of the Tasmanian social and business fabric. And a number of studies of those over the last decade or so, significant in terms of economic output, estimated at around just under $1 billion in Tassie, but also just that headline in that top paragraph, that when you look at the number of social enterprises in Tassie, it's actually quite high relative to population size. It's the highest in the country, except for Northern Territory, which again has that really disparate geographical sort of picture, whereas Tassie is much denser. So that notion of the Tassie community being quite close knit, plays out in this as well. So those social enterprises are an important part of providing a range of services. And the last highlight here is around a wellbeing economy. What does it look like for Tasmania to pursue a sort of a broader wellbeing framework-based approach to overall performance, rather than just focusing on economic growth or unemployment? Because clearly economic growth and unemployment, really, they're the means to an end. The end is that people feel better about themselves and better about the world they're in, which is that wellbeing measure. Tassie government is looking at developing a wellbeing strategy, looking at coming up with some metrics and some targets around that, which is great, really good to see. And I guess I just wanted to sort of, I guess, almost finish on this, that if you think about what I was saying before about business churn and about population churn and people coming and going, getting this stuff right, it's not really a nice to have for Tassie, it's a must have, because it's this overall package that people perceive. If I stay in Tassie or if I move to Tassie, this is the package of benefits that I see I'll be getting. That's very much a sort of a wellbeing lens. And to get that wellbeing lens right means that the package looks better, means that those businesses will grow, businesses will stay, people will come, people will stay. That's how I think when you look at this sort of data over the last decade, that the sweet spots for Tasmania's overall growth have been in that space. Last couple of things, I think we're looking at some of the implications. I won't dwell on those because I'm happy for you to sort of draw those out if you want in the discussion. But if you just could go back for a sec, and I just want to touch on this one here. If you're thinking about that link between population and gross state product and population and gross state product per capita, interesting question is, which leads which? We can see this sort of association in the data. But is it population inflows that are driving output per capita growth, or is it output per capita growth which is causing more people to come and creating those those inflows? When we're thinking about this, I think in some ways it really doesn't matter, because the consequences of that are the same. If the inflows drive economic growth, then policy needs to focus on enhancing all those aspects of livability, not on job creation, but enhancing those aspects of livability, because that'll bring more people in. So things like housing quality and availability, career options for workers, those thicker labour markets, education pathways, quality of service. Get that right, the Tassie will look appealing, those flows will come, and then we get economic growth. But what if it goes the other way? What if inflows are responding to economic growth? If that's the case, in fact, the policy response is similar. If you get in a period of high economic growth, you're getting lots of people coming in, you've got to manage that. You've got to manage those inflows so people's lifestyles don't go backwards because they can't see a GP or they can't get their kids into childcare or into school. So even if those inflows are responding to economic growth, even if the economic growth is coming first, then the policy response is very similar. Looking at housing, keeping those housing stock numbers up, keeping those volumes up, education pathways and quality of service provision. So, kind of whichever way you cut it, I think this focus on these sort of wellbeing measures, on these wellbeing metrics, on these aspects of livability for Tassie are really important. And just the last couple on the next slide here, we looked at specialisation, diversification. Tassie has got some really nice specialisations in some key industries. A lot of smaller regional economies, people think about, well, we've got to, we need to diversify. That's the pathway to sort of economic success. In fact, when you look at the data around Australia, there's as many places that have actually sort of strengthened their local economies through continuing to specialise in stuff they're good at, as those who have strengthened their economies by trying to diversify. There's sort of challenges with both sides, and it shouldn't just be a knee-jerk reaction to say, oh, we need to diversify. We need to diversify. Tassie's got some really good things that could actually leverage some long-term growth from specialising. And then that last one, the key one there about education. I hope I've sort of shown you that data that says that the employers are really looking for higher skilled workers, whether it's trade or professions, as well as people with those sort of community service sector qualifications as well. That flow is not really strong enough for Tassie. So in a way, fixing up those education pathways into those higher paying jobs will work really well. And I'd be sort of advising looking more closely at that than on the classic sort of state or national economic targets are often around job creation. I just say again, I think that in Tassie's case, it's less about encouraging employers to create these higher skilled jobs. All the evidence is that those jobs are there. what Tassie needs to do is make sure the locals can get a better look in at getting some of those higher paid jobs. And that's about it, I reckon, James.
Thanks so much, Kim. Spot on time. Kim cut out about half the slides to get us into that time slot. So there's a stack more in the report itself, which is on the website. So we do encourage people to go and download that. And but hopefully that, as a sort of overview, gives you the highlights and a few deep dives. Now we've got a few questions. I'm going to kick off with Sue, and then I've got a couple on the chat that we'll come to.
Yes, thanks very much, Kim. So just to give you some idea of where the board and the RDA staff are after we worked with Kim on this, we noticed that the view that our natural capital and the industries that flow for that are one of Tasmania's special advantages. So Kim's pointed out the value add of agriculture, and a lot of our tourism is actually associated with food tourism or getting out to our natural environment tourism. So we noticed that we acknowledge that they are very, very important. So we also noticed that on the other side that we have a problem with education system, low literacy, low digital literacy, and directly relevant to that, low participation, and so the need to import people. So we said, look, one of the reasons we have those last bits at the end to say, well, what can we do about that? Now, we're an island. Kim pointed out the cost of freight. We produce great goods, natural capital, great food and fibre and so on. We're also very innovative. So promoting innovation so that we can produce quality niche products that are cheaper to get off the island or are attractive to people to come is what we see as one of our advantages. So hence we're looking at the innovation system, but also the education and skills system to support that. If you look at the attracting people, the wellbeing economy and livability are clearly very important if we want professionals from the mainland. Why social enterprises? Well, they actually they're perhaps one of my personal passions, but they actually combine the enterprising things that I've just talked about with the bringing along those people who might be slightly marginalised in the workforce. So we see that as a way we may perhaps be able to do something. But really, the whole idea of this session is to see what you think. And we've got a few questions there.
Yep. So thanks, Sue.
Yes. Oh, yes.
So let's go to the questions. So we
right. Okay. Right. About to. Yes. Off we go.
So Kim, could you just clarify around the measures that made how you define the tourism sector, given it's not its own under ANZIC?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. So yeah, there are 17 industries that go to make up our sort of national economic picture, and that doesn't include tourism. So the RDA and the Tassie government has a subscription to some economic modelling done through National Economics in Melbourne. I think they do a really, really good job actually, and they have added an 18th sort of grouping, which is a tourism sector. So they've taken out part of the cafes accommodation, part of recreation services, part of art services, using the ABS. I don't want to waffle on too long. The ABS does tourism satellite accounts where it makes an estimate of what those existing 17 industries, what proportion of those might be attributed to tourism. And what the ID profiles do is they take those and they add an 18th category, which is say if we take 10% of accommodation and 5% of cafes, and we add those up, this is the sort of contribution that tourism might be. So the only caveat I put on that is that whereas you can add up all those 17 industries and get the total national economy or state economy, the 18th one is actually a bit of double counting. So it's good for comparing tourism with the others, but you can't just add it back and make the economy look so much bigger. I hope that makes some sense.
Thanks, Kim. That's helpful definition. The next one is one that's often on our minds, which is the assumed correlation between interest rates and house price growth, and also the correlation between interest rates and interstate movement. Do you want to make a comment on those, both of those?
I think it's absolutely critical. We saw, and so I was really annoyed that this is completely missing from the election campaign, and with both sides, but both parties looking to in a sense, make housing cheaper, make housing make housing affordability a bit easier for people by, whether it's tapping into your super or addressing some tax offsets and stuff. I think when people feel like they can pay more for housing, they do. And those house price surges that I put on that chart, they correlated exactly with those 1% fixed interest loans. That's what drove our house price increase across the country. We had no net overseas migration at that point. It wasn't a flood of migrants. It was the fact that we all felt we could pay a little bit more for housing because we could lock in a 5-year 1% interest rate. And you could see the consequences of that, the rapid increase in house prices across the country, wherever it was, even in regional places. So yes, very, very strong correlation between interest rates and house prices, and it does worry me a bit. Yes, we want to have inflation down, we want interest rates to come down, but we can watch, as those RBA rates come down over the next few months, we will see another surge in house prices. It's not going to actually help the end product, which is frustrating. I think from Tassie's point of view, those relativities are really important, particularly I think relativities with probably with the sort of the outer suburbs of Melbourne rather than the inner suburbs. So I think that surge in Launceston was seen as a place very much more affordable for a decent quality of housing, well located. So those folks in outer Melbourne that were looking to move, Launceston was a really good option. Hobart lagged a bit, right, because Hobart is sitting at above about 100 or somewhere between $100,000 and $200,000 per property above Launceston. So that's why Launceston jumped first and jumped furthest, and then Hobart sort of started to follow a bit later. So I think those relativities are really important, as are, I think, this perception that some of the service availabilities has been really squished. Commute times in Hobart have got worse. Wait times to see GPs in Launceston have got worse. So to some extent, we haven't seen the level of predominantly public investment in those kind of social services that we would need given the scale of population growth. And there's certainly been an argument marshalled nationally. You will have heard a lot of people being concerned again during the election campaign about our national productivity levels dropping. So it means it's going to be harder for us to afford the things we want as a nation while that productivity drops. I think there's a stream of analysts that are saying part of that why our national productivity is dropping is because our population has been growing steadily for the last decade or so, but we haven't been reinvesting enough as a nation in that core infrastructure. That transport, social and health infrastructure is lagging. So we've had quite good levels of population growth, which looks good for a while, but then it starts to get really confounded as the constraints on undersupply of those sort of services kicks in. And Tassie's seen a bit of the same, I think. Perceptions that Launceston's not the easy living city now than it was sort of 4 years ago, and the same for Hobart.
Thanks, Kim. Follow-up question from Delara is around businesses doing well, and just noting, and it's a question around the correlation between media and telecommunications and how well they're doing, given their high level of productivity contribution.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's an interesting one. I mean, it's as I said, the numbers of people employed in that industry in Tasmania are fairly low. But the reported level of turnover and value adding by the industry is fairly high. So what I think that says to me is that you've got those businesses are squeezing a lot out of the employers that they have in Tasmania compared to the rest of the country. It's an interesting one because Hobart's a much smaller market for that particular industry than the big capital cities, Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane. So there's a lot more people there and a lot more businesses and a lot more sort of overall output. But it sounds like in that industry, at least, Tassie's in a bit of a sweet spot in that you've got a relatively small scale, but it's actually performing pretty well in terms of business turnover and profitability.
Thanks. A question from Sky around data on specific industry workforce retention, and she makes the point that sort of falls out of your analysis, which is there's a lot of really good packages available. Yeah. Why can't we retain?
Yeah. So there's good data on that at the national level. The Jobs and Skills Australia do regular employer surveys, quite large-scale ones about employer attraction, retention, and churn. So there's good information there about how employers are viewing that retention issue. I don't know offhand how that plays out in Tassie. I was looking at some detailed data for the health sector in Tassie doing this work, and there has been significant growth in. I was looking particularly at nursing, registered nurses, and there were periods of significant growth in the overall number of registered nurses employed in Tassie in the last 18 months, and that coincides with a slight fall in the number of vacancies that are advertised for registered nurses. So it was looking like, there'd been some success in recruiting into those jobs. Retention, I don't know. Look, these are difficult professions to. They can be very demanding, and I know that there's a lot of work going on in different parts of the country, which are sort of partly around, less around the actual workplace environment, which can be quite challenging in a career like nursing, and more around the whole sort of integration with place kind of area. So looking at ways in which you can encourage, particularly people who've come to Tassie to take up some of these occupations, to sort of embed themselves in the community faster. There's a sort of package called Attract, Connect, Stay, which has been around now for about 6 or 7 years. It's doing quite well as a systematic approach to embedding people in the communities that they're coming to quickly, and that seems to make their experience better, and they're less likely then to move on quickly. But that's all the soft stuff, around building social capital and helping people feel welcome. It's not around the actual workplace environment. And clearly, for an individual, there's a lot going on: relative wages, working conditions, as well as that sort of overall living environment. There's quite a lot going on for an individual when they make that decision about whether to stay or whether to move on somewhere else. Certainly, I did notice, looking at the data again, and I want to make that point clear as well, there's often a perception in Tassie that Tasmanians feel like mainlanders have to take a salary cut to come to Tasmania. I think that may be true in a small number of CEO type roles, but when you look at the advertised salary rates in Tassie, and I did this just for earlier this year, the advertised salary rates for some core occupations, teachers, police, public sector, private sector, they were very similar. The only one that was a little bit off was teachers, but Tassie's clearly done a lot of work to match nursing salaries, for instance, matching police salaries, for instance. So it's not just that there's no real solid evidence there that mainlanders have to take a salary cut when they come to Tassie, except perhaps for a small number of those sort of highly small number of sort of executive roles. So Tassie, I think, doing quite well to try to match the salary component, which means then that your decision will be based on other factors, like what's it like in the workplace and what's it like in your suburb.
So we do have a handful of minutes left, but we do want to get people out well and truly on time. So if there's any other questions, pop your hand up. Sue is itching to make another comment.
Yes, sorry. Whilst people are thinking, I can just follow up on that, Kim. So the University of Tasmania has just announced that GPs or doctors can be fully trained outside of Hobart, and the whole rural health education network is very good at doing what you describe, which is embedding people, students, into the community as they're studying health. And there's a lot of evidence that students who study regionally don't necessarily stay in the region they studied, but they move from region to region. So, for example, we've got doctors who trained in Townsville who've moved here and vice versa. So that embedding thing, which rural health is quite good at, is one of the things that we at RDA are exploring in some of the packages that you mentioned, which I guess emphasises that what we need is not just one policy change, but we need multiple ones, which is a point that you've made before.
That's right. It's that overall package that people perceive as in thinking about making a move to Tassie or leaving Tassie. Now, I know that Lisa Denny, who was on the call before, did some really interesting work about 18 months ago looking at why people leave. And that was I think, Lisa, the key thing you found there was it was that sort of perceived thinness of the labour market was a key driver in people wanting to go sort of either to the mainland or back to the mainland. So it is that, you know, there's a lot. Tasmania has a lot to gain. It's got a lot of benefits from the small scale, but it will have a lot to gain from, you know, thickening up those labour market options, you know, improving, seeing those sort of continuing improvements in the numbers and diversity of higher skilled jobs in particular, because that will help those people to feel like there is a pathway for them and their spouses and their families while they stay in Tasmania too.
Thank you, Kim. So just a reminder that this is the entree. This is the taster. And just to give people who just want to understand the highlights, that's what today was, largely informational. We're doing some deep dives, ground truthing, if you like, within each of the regions in partnership with, in the Northwest, with Cradle Coast Authority, in partnership with NTDC in the north and down south. The numbers are capped and they are rapidly filling. So if you do want to pop along, and it's not just a curiosity thing, if you think you've got some insights that can help us as RDA TAS, as Sue said earlier, sort of progress this conversation about how we support all three levels of government and community and business with this thriving Tasmania, we need to do some deeper dives at a regional level and further. So these workshops are really about hearing from people that have got insights in each of those regions that we can further finesse the work that Kim's done with us to make sure that the strategies going forward are as detailed and meaningful and have got the leverage that we all hope. So there's some QR codes on the screen there. You'll also find the details there. So otherwise reach out to us. As I say, numbers are capped. So please, if you think you have something to contribute to those workshops, then please do sign up. The link to the presentation and the recording will be on the website, and the full report is already there. And we would encourage you to engage with us, either with one of the regional coordinators, regional development coordinators, or through myself or Abby or Sue. So please do make contact if you want to engage more, or you can, I'm sure Kim will be happy for a quick question if you shot him a note. But it's best to engage through us in the first instance. And we certainly encourage that. And let me echo Sue's comment at the beginning. Thank you very much for coming. This is a pivotal piece of work for us, and the engagement from here on is really important for us as we move towards a new strategy for Tasmania. So thank you, and have a good rest of the day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.